From a bitter on-set feud that ended in an unlikely friendship to the show that literally replaced Batman and then bombed spectacularly, the second 100 years hides some of television's most bizarre backstage secrets. This forgotten 1967 sitcom about a frozen prospector features Star Trek connections, an episode pulled after a presidential assassination, and a leading man who became his co-star's legal guardian decades later. Fact 1. Inspired by a random newspaper clipping. Sometimes the strangest television concepts come from the most unexpected places, and The Second 100 Years is a perfect example of this phenomenon. The show's creator, Roswell Rogers, didn't dream up the idea of a frozen prospector being thawed out after decades in suspended animation through some elaborate creative process or brainstorming session with a team of writers. Instead, the entire premise came to him after he happened to read a single newspaper article in a Los Angeles paper about frozen bodies discovered in Alaska. That one random clipping sparked his imagination and became the foundation for what would become an entire television series about a gold prospector named Luke Carpenter, who gets buried in a glacial avalanche in 1900 and wakes up 67 years later looking exactly the same age as his own grandson. Rogers took this fascinating real-world concept about preservation in ice and turned it into a comedic fish-out-of-water story where a man from the turn of the century has to navigate the modern world of 1967 with all its confusing technology, changing social norms, and cultural differences. The show ran for 26 episodes during the 1967 to 1968 season on ABC, proving that sometimes a single interesting news story can be enough to launch an entire television production. Fact 2. Gene Roddenberry's wife appeared in the pilot. Star Trek fans watching the pilot episode of The Second 100 Years today might be shocked to spot a very familiar face in a small but memorable role. Moyle Barrett, who would later become known to millions as Nurse Christine Chapel on the original Star Trek series and eventually marry Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry, appeared in the very first episode of the show, playing an Army psychiatrist. At the time the pilot aired in September of 1967, Barrett was already well known in science fiction circles for her work on Star Trek, which had premiered the previous year, and she was dating Roddenberry, though they wouldn't officially marry until 1969. In the episode, her character examines Luke Carpenter, the prospector who has just been thawed out after being frozen in ice for 67 years, which makes sense given that the military would want a psychiatric evaluation of someone who survived such an impossible ordeal. Barrett's appearance in the show demonstrates just how active she was in television during this period, taking guest roles on various series while simultaneously working on Star Trek, and it creates an interesting connection between two very different science fiction adjacent shows from the same era. Fact 3. Arthur O'Connell thought he was the star. When Arthur O'Connell signed on to The Second 100 Years, he had every reason to believe he would be the show's leading man, and the confusion that followed created some serious behind-the-scenes drama. O'Connell was already a highly respected veteran actor with 2 Academy Award nominations under his belt for his performances in Picnic and Anatomy of a Murder. So when he was approached about the series, he was told that he would receive top billing as the star of the show. However, when production began, O'Connell discovered that the network and producers had instead given top billing to Monty Markham, a relatively unknown actor at the time who was playing the dual role of both Luke Carpenter, the frozen prospector, and Ken Carpenter, Luke's grandson, who looked exactly like him. This bait and switch made O'Connell absolutely furious, and he felt betrayed by the Hollywood executives who had promised him star status only to demote him to second billing in favor of a newcomer. The situation was particularly frustrating for O'Connell because he had specifically avoided taking regular television roles for years, holding out until he could be guaranteed the lead position. And now he found himself playing support to someone with far less experience and recognition in the industry. The tension between the two actors was noticeable during the early episodes, and O'Connell made it clear that he would never again trust the word of any Hollywood executive after this experience. Fact 4. The co-stars' feud had a heartwarming ending. While the initial tension between Arthur O'Connell and Monty Markham could have permanently damaged their relationship, the story actually has a surprisingly touching conclusion that shows how professional disagreements can transform into genuine friendship over time. According to reports from people close to the production, Markham recognized that O'Connell was upset about the billing situation and tried to smooth things over by inviting the veteran actor to lunch, hoping they could talk through the issue and find common ground. At first, O'Connell wasn't interested in making peace and remained resentful about being promised star status only to have it taken away. But as they continued working together throughout the show's single season, the two men gradually developed a mutual respect and eventually a real friendship that extended far beyond the series' cancellation. The most remarkable part of this story came many years later when O'Connell's health began to decline, and he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, a devastating condition that would ultimately claim his life in May of 1981. During this difficult period, Monty Markham stepped up in an extraordinary way and became O'Connell's legal conservator, taking responsibility for supervising his former co-star's medical care and making sure he received proper treatment until his death. Markham's children even came to affectionately call O'Connell Uncle Arthur, showing just how close the families had become despite the rocky start to their professional relationship decades earlier. Fact 5. Future Oscar nominee. Karen Black was a regular before. Karen Black became one of the most recognized and celebrated actresses of the 1970s. She was taking small recurring roles on television shows like The Second 100 Years to build her career and gain experience in front of the camera. Black appeared in 2 episodes of the series playing Marcia Garraway, who was the daughter of Colonel Garraway, a military officer character who kept tabs on Luke Carpenter because the government considered the thawed prospector to be something of a military secret. At the time she filmed these episodes in 1967, Black was still a relatively unknown actress who had only recently made her first significant film appearance in Francis Ford Coppola's You're a Big Boy Now the previous year, and she was actively taking whatever television work she could find to make ends meet and establish herself in Hollywood. Just 2 years after The Second 100 Years ended, Black would land her breakthrough role in the counterculture classic Easy Rider in 1969, playing a prostitute alongside Dennis Hopper, Peter Fonda, and Jack Nicholson, which opened the door to even bigger opportunities. The following year, in 1970, she starred opposite Jack Nicholson again in 5 Easy Pieces, delivering a performance that earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress and a Golden Globe Award, cementing her status as a serious dramatic actress and making her early television appearances on shows like The Second 100 Years feel like fascinating glimpses of a major talent just before she broke through to stardom. Fact 6. It replaced Batman and died trying. In what turned out to be one of the most disastrous scheduling decisions in television history, ABC decided to move The Second 100 Years into the Thursday night 7:30 time slot that had just been vacated by the campy superhero series Batman when it was canceled in March of 1968. The network executives apparently thought that giving the struggling sitcom the prime time slot that had previously belonged to one of their most popular shows would boost its ratings and give it a second chance at finding an audience. But the plan backfired spectacularly in ways nobody could have predicted. Batman had been a cultural phenomenon when it first premiered, and even though its popularity had declined significantly by its 3rd season, the show still had a loyal following and name recognition that The Second 100 Years simply couldn't match or replace. Only 2 new episodes of The Second 100 Years actually aired in the Thursday night time slot before ABC pulled the plug on the series, and then the network just ran repeats for a few more months until September of 1968, when they finally replaced it with another new sitcom called The Ugliest Girl in Town. The whole situation demonstrated just how quickly a network could lose faith in a show, and it meant that The Second 100 Years had the dubious distinction of being the series that tried to fill Batman's shoes and failed miserably in just over a week. Fact 7. Competing against TV's biggest hit. When The Second 100 Years premiered on Wednesday nights at 8:30 in the evening in September of 1967, ABC scheduled it directly opposite one of the most dominant television programs in the entire country, which was essentially setting the new show up for failure from the very beginning. The competition it faced was The Beverly Hillbillies, a sitcom about a poor family that strikes oil and moves to California, which had been an absolute ratings juggernaut for CBS since it first premiered in 1962 and was still pulling in massive audiences 5 years later. The Beverly Hillbillies wasn't just popular, it was one of the most watched programs on all of television during this period, consistently ranking in the top 10 shows and attracting tens of millions of viewers every single week, which made it nearly impossible for any competing program to gain traction in the same time slot. For a new and relatively unknown sitcom like The Second 100 Years, with unproven stars and a strange premise about a frozen prospector going head-to-head against such an established hit, was a death sentence that doomed the show before it even had a chance to find its audience. The mismatch was so severe that even though The Second 100 Years premiered with decent ratings, viewers quickly returned to watching The Clampett Family instead, and the show's numbers plummeted within just a few weeks of its debut. Fact 8. Executive producer ran 2 fantasy shows. Simultaneously, Harry Ackerman had an incredibly busy fall season in 1967 because he was simultaneously serving as the executive producer for 2 completely different fantasy-themed sitcoms that both premiered on ABC within weeks of each other. In addition to overseeing The Second 100 Years, with its premise about a prospector frozen in time, Ackerman was also running The Flying Nun, the show starring Sally Field as a nun whose lightweight frame and aerodynamic cornet headpiece allowed her to actually fly through the air. Both programs were produced by Screen Gems, which was the television production arm of Columbia Pictures, and both represented the kind of high-concept fantasy comedies that were incredibly popular during the 1960s alongside shows like Bewitched, my favorite, Martian, and I Dream of Jeannie. Ackerman was already a well-established producer in Hollywood by this point in his career, having worked on numerous successful television projects, and he clearly had a talent for identifying and developing shows with fantastical or supernatural elements that appealed to family audiences. The fact that he was juggling 2 such different productions at the same time shows just how in demand he was as a producer, though it's worth noting that The Flying Nun ended up being far more successful than The Second 100 Years, running for 3 full seasons and 82 episodes compared to just 1 season and 26 episodes for the Frozen Prospector show. Fact 9. An episode was pulled after RFK's assassination. In one of the most somber moments in the show's history, ABC made the decision to pull a scheduled rerun episode of The Second 100 Years from the airwaves on June 6, 1968, just 1 day after Senator Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles following his victory in the California presidential primary. The episode that was supposed to air that Thursday evening was called A Couple of Sad Dads, which had originally been broadcast back in November of 1967, and the network felt that the content was simply too inappropriate to show given the national tragedy that had just occurred. The plot of the episode involved both Luke and his son Edwin mistakenly believing that the other only had a few months left to live, which led to various comedic misunderstandings and emotional moments as they tried to cope with the idea of losing each other. More problematically, the episode included multiple scenes that took place in a funeral home, showing the characters planning for death and dealing with mortality in ways that would have been deeply insensitive to air while the entire country was mourning the loss of yet another Kennedy and preparing for his actual funeral. ABC simply substituted a different episode in its place, recognizing that even though The Second 100 Years was just a lighthearted sitcom, there was no way they could broadcast content about death and funeral planning during such a painful moment in American history. Fact 10. Critics unanimously hated it, despite strong ratings. The Second 100 Years had one of the strangest premiere situations in television history because while the critics absolutely savaged the show with some of the harshest reviews imaginable, regular viewers actually tuned in during the first few weeks and gave it surprisingly strong ratings. Broadcasting Magazine published excerpts from about a dozen different reviews of the series premiere and nearly every single one of them was brutally negative, with critics competing to see who could trash the show most effectively. Bernie Harrison of the Washington Evening Star complained that the premiere seemed far more interested in playing for a series of quick laughs, while Peggy Constantine of the Chicago Sun-Times dismissed it as nothing more than frothy nonsense. And Clay Gowron of the Chicago Tribune delivered perhaps the most damning assessment by saying that the best thing about the second 100 years was that it's only a half-hour long. Despite this critical drubbing, the show actually performed quite well in the ratings when it first debuted on September 6, 1967, suggesting that audiences were intrigued by the concept of a frozen prospector coming back to life and wanted to see how the premise would play out week after week. However, the initial curiosity didn't last long, and by October of 1967, just 1 month after the premiere, the ratings had completely collapsed, and the show had dropped into the bottom 25 programs on television, proving that the critics might have been onto something after all. Fact 11. The split-screen effects were unusually sophisticated. One aspect of the second 100 years that actually impressed viewers and critics alike was the technical quality of the split-screen photography that allowed Monty Markham to appear as both Luke and Ken in the same scene, which was a crucial element of the show since many episodes featured the grandfather and grandson interacting with each other. The production team used photographic mats and carefully planned camera work to create these dual-role sequences, and multiple people who watched the show noted that the effects were handled much more skillfully than similar techniques used on other sitcoms from the same era. The Patty Duke Show, which had featured actress Patty Duke playing identical cousins who frequently appeared together on screen, and Bewitched, which sometimes showed Elizabeth Montgomery playing both Samantha and her look-alike cousin Serena, both relied on comparable split-screen technology. But the seams where the two halves of the image met were often quite visible, and the interactions between the characters could look awkward or unconvincing. In contrast, the technical crew working on the second 100 years managed to make the split-screen effects much more seamless and believable, helping viewers accept that they were watching two different people rather than one actor filmed twice. The smooth integration of these scenes was particularly important because, unlike shows where the look-alike characters only appeared together occasionally, this show needed Luke and Ken to interact regularly as part of its basic premise. Fact 12. It had a second life on Cable 2 decades later. Long after the second 100 years disappeared from network television, the show unexpectedly found a new audience when the cable channel USA Network began airing reruns starting in January of 1986, nearly 2 decades after the series had been canceled by ABC. USA Network kept the show in rotation for an impressively long time, broadcasting episodes continuously from January through December of 1986, then bringing it back again from March to May of 1987, and finally airing it one more time from September of 1987 through February of 1988. This meant that an entirely new generation of viewers who hadn't even been born when the show originally premiered in 1967 got the chance to discover the adventures of Luke Carpenter and his family, and many people who fondly remember the series today actually watched it during these cable reruns rather than during its original network run. The reruns were part of a larger trend in the 1980s, where cable channels were digging through the vaults of old television shows and giving forgotten series a second chance to find audiences, and USA Network in particular was known for filling its daytime and late-night schedule with classic sitcoms and dramas from previous decades. Screen Gems, the production company that made the show, also packaged it as part of a syndication deal called The Magic Show during the 1980s, which included several other fantasy-themed sitcoms. Fact 13. Only 15 of 26 episodes survive on DVD. For anyone who wants to watch the second 100 years from start to finish today, they're going to run into a frustrating problem because even though the show produced 26 complete half-hour episodes during its single season on ABC, only 15 of those episodes have ever been made available on any kind of home video format. These 15 episodes were released on unofficial DVD sets by small companies that specialize in obscure television shows, typically spread across 3 discs, but they represent less than 60% of the series' total output, which means that 11 episodes remain essentially lost to modern viewers who don't have access to old film prints or television archives. The situation is particularly disappointing because the missing episodes include some important storylines and character development that would help viewers understand the full arc of the series, and without access to the complete run, it's impossible to get a proper sense of how the show evolved over the course of its brief time on the air. Major studios and streaming services have shown little interest in acquiring the rights to The Second 100 Years or putting resources into tracking down and restoring the missing episodes, probably because the show wasn't successful enough during its original run to justify the expense of a proper preservation effort. This means that fans of the series are stuck with incomplete collections and have to hope that someday the remaining episodes might surface in a studio vault or private collection. Fact 14. Arthur O'Connell chose toothpaste over acting. After The Second 100 Years ended and Arthur O'Connell's television career began to wind down in the early 1970s, the veteran actor made a surprising and somewhat unconventional decision about how he wanted to spend the rest of his working life. O'Connell landed a series of television commercials for Crest toothpaste, where he played a friendly neighborhood pharmacist, and these advertisements turned out to be so lucrative and required so little of his time compared to the demands of film and television production that he essentially retired from traditional acting roles. What made the situation even more remarkable was that O'Connell didn't keep quiet about his decision, instead openly and gleefully telling people that he was being paid so much money for appearing in these toothpaste commercials that he saw absolutely no reason to take any other acting jobs ever again. For a man who had been nominated for 2 Academy Awards for his performances in Picnic and Anatomy of a Murder, and had appeared in dozens of major Hollywood films over the course of his career, the fact that he was willing to walk away from serious dramatic work to focus exclusively on selling toothpaste was both surprising and somewhat amusing to people in the industry. O'Connell continued appearing in the Crest commercials by his own choice until his health began to decline in the mid-1970s due to Alzheimer's disease, which eventually forced him into full retirement. Fact 15. TV Guide called it one of the worst shows ever. The ultimate insult to The Second 100 Years came years after it had been canceled and mostly forgotten, when TV Guide, which was the most influential television magazine in America at the time, included the series on a list of the worst programs in television history. This kind of recognition is something that no show wants to receive, especially since TV Guide's opinions carried enormous weight with both industry professionals and regular viewers who relied on the magazine to guide their viewing choices and understand television trends. The declaration that The Second 100 Years was among the absolute worst shows ever made put it in the company of other legendary television failures and cemented its reputation as a prime example of a concept that simply didn't work, despite having talented actors and a production team with proven track records. Some fans of the show who remembered it fondly from their childhoods have defended it over the years, arguing that TV Guide's harsh assessment was unfair and that the series deserved credit for at least trying something different with its time travel premise and fish-out-of-water comedy. But the magazine's brutal verdict has stuck in the cultural memory far more than any positive recollections. The fact that TV Guide singled out this particular show when there were countless other failed sitcoms from the 1960s suggests that there was something about The Second 100 Years that critics found especially disappointing or poorly executed.